In 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company, prompting an invasion by Israel, France, and Britain. Over in Washington, D.C., a dinner party was being held at Walter Lippmann's house, attended by many of the Washington elite, including CIA Director Allen Dulles. The conversation turned to Nasser when one of the guests jokingly opined, "Allen, can't you find an assassin?" But Allen Dulles responded in all seriousness. While smoking his pipe, he replied, "Well, first you would need a fanatic, a man who'd be willing to kill himself if he were caught, and he couldn't be an outsider. It would be very difficult to find just the right man." What if I told you that Lee Harvey Oswald, the man charged with John F. Kennedy's murder, had no motive to kill him? George de Mohrenschildt, Oswald's dear friend and CIA handler, testified to the Warren Commission that Oswald was jealous of Kennedy's wealth, success, and his beautiful wife. But he later published a book in which he recanted all those damning statements that helped frame Oswald as the killer. Lee was not jealous. He was an admirer of President Kennedy. But one man in Washington had all the motivation in the world to kill Kennedy, and he had all the means to do so. It was the same man who orchestrated MK-Ultra, the CIA's mind control and psychological torture program, the same man who orchestrated coups in Guatemala and Iran, and the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. He'd also launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, which very well may have led him to conducting an assassination of another head of state on American soil. This is the story of Allen Dulles. I hate my husband. I hate my husband. I hate my husband. Oh, how I hate my husband. I want to kill him. I will be like a fighting cock with knives on my talons. I will cut him in ribbons with sharp knives. I will cut him in the back. I will even perhaps cut his throat with a sharp knife tied to my talons, when I am a bloody, murderous fighting cock. That's Clover Todd Dulles, Allen Dulles' wife. As you may imagine, Dulles didn't exactly treat women with the utmost tenderness and compassion. His sister Eleanor claims he'd had at least 100 affairs. During World War I, when Dulles was working as a diplomat in Switzerland, he began an affair with a young Czech woman in the U.S. legation office. When British intelligence told him that she was actually a double agent working for the Germans, Dulles took her out to dinner, then took her on an evening stroll along the cobblestone streets, right into the arms of British intelligence. She was never seen again. Dulles had quite the capacity for cruelty. He showed a coldness and lack of empathy for others from a young age. Eleanor Dulles, his sister, described an incident at their family's summer getaway in Watertown, New York. When Allen, who was 9 at the time, watched his 5-year-old sister Natalie fall into a lake. She was flailing and unable to rescue herself, and he just stood there and watched, even though he was a strong swimmer. His mother had to run out from inside the house to save her. This cold detachment from others would serve him well into his adulthood, as it allowed him to work with the most unsavory of characters, including fascists and war criminals. Allen and his brother, the future Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, would run Sullivan and Cromwell, the corporate law firm in New York. Their clients included Germany's Krupp Steel and IG Farben, which produced the Zyklon B poison used in concentration camps during World War II. They also made extensive use of slave labor. The Dulles brothers would go to great lengths to keep these nasty secrets from coming to surface. Shredding of captured Nazi records was the favorite tactic of Dulles and his associates. At the war's end, Allen Dulles would secure the escape of untold numbers of Nazi war criminals while he served as chief of station at the OSS Bern office. In April 1945, Dulles personally snuck SS General Karl Wolff and Colonel Walter Rauff to freedom as part of Operation Sunrise. Rauff was the one who created the Black Raven gas vans that killed as many as 250,000 people on the Eastern Front. These vans would be the precursor to the gas chambers. After being put up in an apartment in Rome by the U.S. Strategic Services Unit, Rauff escaped and winded up in Chile, where he became an advisor to Pinochet's secret police. That apartment in Rome would hold numerous Nazi war criminals. There they were protected from army Nazi hunters. Back in Washington, Dulles helped create the State Department's Office of Policy Coordination, which would be headed by Frank Wisner. There they'd use millions of dollars in stolen Nazi loot to fund anti-communist operations, as well as skimming from the Marshall Plan Fund. They would employ Nazis and Nazi collaborators for propaganda and covert operations, numbering in the tens of thousands. The Dulles brothers leveraged their powerful corporate positions to insert themselves deep into Republican politics. They provided one of their own attorneys to run Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidential campaign, and apparently tapped Richard Nixon to be his running mate. Allen used his position at CIA to good use, digging up dirt on Democratic candidates and funneling money through front groups to the Eisenhower-Nixon campaign. Allen and Foster earned Eisenhower's good graces, and they were generously rewarded. Foster would rule the diplomatic arm of the federal government at U.S. State, and Allen became the Director of Central Intelligence. That year was 1953, and Mohammad Mossadegh of Iran would nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. What followed was the plot to overthrow him. After a crippling economic blockade, the CIA paid agents to create large angry mobs, which stormed the Prime Minister's residence. Rebel forces rolled 24 tanks alongside them, and fired an artillery shell into the residence. Mossadegh barely made it out alive by scaling a fence. Mohammad Reza Shah would take his place, and with the help of the CIA, they'd create a security apparatus that tortured thousands of people. The next year came the toppling of another government, this time in Central America. Before 1950, the United Fruit Company owned nearly every mile of railway in Guatemala, along with the entire telephone system and the only port on the Atlantic coast. It was also the single largest landowner in the country. A new nationalist president named Jacobo Arbenz promised to repatriate some of this splendor with a bill that expropriated land that wasn't under cultivation. He also offered compensation for the loss. But Arbenz had gravely underestimated the wrath that would follow. CIA pilots rained bombs down on Guatemala City, and the president fled fearing for his life. The US had installed a colonel by the name of Carlos Castillo Armas, turning Guatemala from a democracy into a military dictatorship. In one of the most violent examples of US regime change, the CIA provided military officers with killing manuals, or more specifically, CIA handbooks on how to carry out political assassinations. They even provided a so-called disposal list of 58 targets to be liquidated. That list grew to more than 70,000 people, or 10% of the adult population of Guatemala. The violence and genocide of the native population that followed would kill hundreds of thousands. Meanwhile, another covert operation was taking place at home. The Cold War had ushered in a new kind of technological race, the race for control of the human brain. The CIA would utilize university professors, doctors, and scientists at dozens of institutions to study brainwashing and psychological coercion, or more accurately, psychological torture. Expanding on the previously named Operation Artichoke, the program would take on a new name, MKUltra. Subjects for this human experimentation were the most vulnerable, including prisoners at CIA black sites, who suffered drug-induced psychosis and even death. Others were found in the halls of hospitals and mental asylums. Without their consent, the sick and the mentally ill were fed mind-altering drugs, such as high doses of LSD and methamphetamine. They would be kept in solitary confinement for days or even weeks. Allen Dulles' depravity knew no bounds, as even his own son wasn't spared. He sanctioned CIA doctors from the MKUltra program to conduct experiments on Allen Dulles Jr., who had suffered a brain injury in the Korean War. These experiments included insulin shock therapy, intentionally overdosing Allen Jr. with insulin, causing violent convulsions and excruciating pain. He told his sister Joan, "Can't you do something for me? I'm going mad." In April of 1959, Allen's brother, John Foster Dulles, would die of an aggressive colon cancer. The Dulles brothers as a pair were no more, and it fell on Allen to carry on their legacy. With Eisenhower's second term coming to a close, the race was on to secure a seat in the new administration. He'd played both sides of the 1960 presidential campaign, feeding intelligence to Richard Nixon and Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy. Kennedy would of course win by a razor-thin margin, and to appease the Republicans still in the federal government, he'd keep two Republican bigwigs. J. Edgar Hoover would remain at FBI, and Allen Dulles would remain the Director of Central Intelligence. As usual, Allen Dulles' clever political maneuvering would pay off. Dulles would undermine Kennedy's foreign policy immediately. Actually, before he even got into office, Dulles was conspiring with the Belgians to overthrow the democratically elected government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Dulles' CIA would provide intelligence and material support to the military, particularly those loyal to future despot Joseph Mobutu. The newly elected post-colonial leader, Patrice Lumumba, would be put into quite an unlucky position, driven out of Kinshasa and running for his life. He'd be chased down with the help of the CIA and Belgian intelligence. Agency assets would savagely beat Lumumba and his family, even his 1-year-old son. They'd then kill Lumumba in cold blood. Kennedy wouldn't find out for a month after the killing. You see, Kennedy's politics were too disparate from the old Republican Guard, who still had a strong hold on the Pentagon, the CIA, even the White House. And the establishment soon came to resent him, even hate him for it. Years after Kennedy's death, H.R. Haldeman, aka Bob Haldeman, was the chief of staff for the Nixon White House. Haldeman is best known for his role in the Watergate scandal, as he was actually convicted on conspiracy, perjury, and obstruction of justice charges. But a less well-known fact of his life adds some interesting insight into the fate of President John F. Kennedy. In his post-Watergate book, titled The Ends of Power, Haldeman describes conversations with Nixon, his boss, which were all recorded in what are now known as the Watergate tapes. In these tapes, Nixon is heard covering his tracks and trying to keep his team of CIA conspirators from talking, including Howard Hunt, the ringleader of the Watergate burglars. Nixon is famously heard offering $1 million in cash to shut them up. But Nixon is very clear on keeping Howard Hunt quiet specifically, based on his long history with the CIA. Hunt had overseen the Guatemala coup and other covert operations, like the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Hunt will uncover a lot of things. You open that scab, there's a hell of a lot of things. This is going to open up that whole Bay of Pigs thing, and it's going to make the CIA look bad. It's going to make Hunt look bad, and is likely to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing. And we think it would be very unfortunate for the CIA and for the country at this time. Bob Haldeman would later clarify these remarks in his memoir. It seems that in all those references to the Bay of Pigs, he was actually referring to the Kennedy assassination. The Bay of Pigs invasion was launched on April 17, 1961. Over 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles approached the island from the ocean, in what has since been called an extraordinarily disorganized and poorly planned operation. Most of the fighters would be killed or captured, but we now know that the plan was flawed from the beginning, on purpose. The military and CIA wanted to use the failed Bay of Pigs fiasco to usher in a full military invasion of Cuba. The chief of naval operations, Admiral R. Lee Burke, even took the liberty of going behind Kennedy's back to position naval destroyers with Marine battalions off the shores of Cuba, anticipating that U.S. forces might be ordered into Cuba to salvage a botched invasion. They also hoped that Kennedy would assist the plan further with air support. Kennedy said no to all of it. Leaving the work of the CIA to speak for itself, the Bay of Pigs invasion was nothing but a monumental failure that fell right onto Allen Dulles' lap. After the failed invasion, Kennedy went on the attack. Rumors started spreading in the agency that the president was going to commence a reduction in force, codenamed the 701 program. Roughly 1 in 5 employees would end up being canned. And then there was the man at the top, Allen Dulles, who was forced into retirement. Allen Dulles had been crossed, and this wasn't a man that let anyone get away with that. Kennedy quickly became extraordinarily unpopular. No, hated by the top Republican brass at the Pentagon, the agency, and the White House. Daniel Ellsberg, who later became famous for leaking the Pentagon Papers, describes the atmosphere at the time. There was virtually a coup atmosphere in Pentagon circles. Not that I had the fear that there was about to be a coup. I just thought it was a mood of hatred and rage. The atmosphere was poisonous. Poisonous. It was 2003, and Howard Hunt, the agency man and Watergate conspirator, was essentially on his deathbed. He was 84, and his long-estranged son, St. John, wanted him to open up about his endeavors as a spy before he left this earth. St. John never believed his father's story of where he was on the day of Kennedy's death. Howard had testified to Congress that he was in Washington, but Dorothy, St. John's mother, contradicted that story and told him he was actually in Dallas. After prodding his father for the story for years and writing him a long, pleading letter, Howard finally obliged, and his son flew to South Florida to see him in what would be his last conversations with his father. Hunt explained to his son that in 1963, he had been invited to a clandestine meeting attended by numerous CIA agents connected to the anti-Castro movement. These included future Watergate burglar Frank Sturgis and CIA assassin David Morales. Morales was the chief of operations at the largest CIA station in Miami called JM Wave. They were all gathered to discuss an operation, but it quickly became clear to Hunt that this operation was the assassination of the president. According to Hunt, Morales and Sturgis referred to the president's killing as the big event. Morales told Hunt that he had been picked for the operation by Bill Harvey, a CIA man who oversaw the many assassination plots against Fidel Castro. He'd also served as chief of station in Rome. According to his Rome deputy, Wyatt, when the news broke about Kennedy's death, Bill Harvey's reaction indicated that he had prior knowledge. Harvey has long been suspected of playing a role in the killing, and according to Wyatt, Harvey traveled to Dallas in November of 1963. The Kennedy assassination would be investigated yet again by the House of Representatives from 1976 to 1978. According to the committee's prosecutor, Dan Hardway, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that Harvey was in Dallas in November 1963. We considered Harvey to be one of our prime suspects from the very start. He had all the key connections, to organized crime, to the CIA station in Miami where the plots against Castro were run, to other prime CIA suspects like David Phillips. We tried to get Harvey's travel vouchers and security file from the CIA, but they always blocked us. But we did come across a lot of memos that suggested he was traveling a lot in the months leading up to the assassination. What Hunt described to his son was a plan that was overseen by Bill Harvey and David Morales, contracting sharpshooters from the Corsican underworld, who had a long history with the CIA. 10 years later, in 1973, after an evening of heavy drinking, Morales would let slip what happened to his attorney. We took care of that son of a bitch, didn't we? Lee Harvey Oswald, the man accused of Kennedy's assassination, is now known to have been an asset for American intelligence agencies. Upon his arrest, Oswald attempted to call a military intelligence officer in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was probably calling his cutout. He was calling somebody who could put him in touch with his case officer. Prior to the assassination, Oswald was the subject of secret intelligence reports at CIA, FBI, State Department, and the Office of Naval Intelligence. Everywhere you look with him, there are the fingerprints of intelligence. After Kennedy's death, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover immediately pulled CIA surveillance tapes of phone calls supposedly made by Oswald. It quickly became clear that the voice on the tapes was not Oswald's. They were an impersonator, calling the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico. Hoover informed Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, who was stunned by this fact, since it revealed that Oswald was deeply involved in espionage activities. Lee was also being groomed by George de Mohrenschildt, the man from the beginning of the story who recanted his testimony. Mohrenschildt's spy handler was Colonel Lawrence Orloff, a CIA informant who was a partner of J. Walton Moore, the CIA's station chief in Dallas. But here's perhaps one of the most damning pieces of evidence. In September of 1963, Oswald was spotted in Dallas by Cuban exile leader Antonio Veciana. What makes this sighting so spectacular is that Oswald was accompanied by David Atlee Phillips, a CIA legend and a major player in Latin American intelligence operations. He would later be investigated for his role in the assassination by the 1976 House Committee. This gave much further weight to his close ties with American intelligence agencies. So, was Oswald the CIA shooter? Well, there are serious issues with the evidence. We need only look directly from the Warren Commission and House Committee investigation reports and transcripts. What follows is just some of that evidence that throws a wrench at the official narrative. Starting with the gun. According to the government's firearms expert for the Warren Commission, a gunsmith from Aberdeen Proving Ground, the sight on the rifle was built for a left-handed shooter. Also during the Warren Commission, Oswald's brother John testified that Lee was right-handed. The rifle, an Italian Mannlicher Carcano, was also horribly inaccurate. Test firing done by Ronald Simmons, the chief of infantry weapons for the Army, showed it fired high and to the right. Then there was Sebastian Latona, the FBI expert for the Warren Commission. He personally dusted the gun for fingerprints, and, well, here's an exchange with him and assistant counsel Melvin Eisenberg. I was not successful in developing any prints at all on the weapon. I also had one of the firearm examiners dismantle the weapon, and I processed the complete weapon, all parts, everything else, and no latent prints of value were developed. Does that include the clip? That included the clip, that included the bolt, it included the underside of the barrel, which is covered by the stock. Were cartridge cases furnished to you at that time? They were, which I processed, and from which I got no prints. Therefore, the net result of your work on Exhibit 139 was that you could not produce an identifiable print? That's correct. After shots were fired at Dealey Plaza, the scene of the crime, dozens of people, including at least 21 Dallas police officers, immediately rushed the so-called grassy knoll, searching for the killer. The grassy knoll at Dealey Plaza stands in front of where Kennedy was shot, while the Warren Committee concluded that all shots were fired from the president's rear. Out of 216 witnesses, 52 said they heard shots coming from the grassy knoll, while 48 said the book depository. 37 couldn't tell where the shots came from, and 70 weren't asked at all. An hour after the assassination, Secret Service agent Richard Johnson received the so-called magic bullet, which traveled through Kennedy's throat, from Parkland Hospital head of security O.P. Wright. Wright was previously a Dallas police officer himself, and well-versed in rifle cartridges. He described the bullet as a .30-30 round with a pointed tip. It did not resemble the magic bullet that was shown to him later, the one now held at the National Archives. That one has a flat tip. It wasn't only Wright who didn't recognize this new bullet, but also Secret Service agent Richard Johnson, Secret Service Director James J. Rowley, and the orderly who found the bullet at Parkland Hospital, Darrell Tomlinson. Also at Parkland Hospital were the two surgeons who operated on Kennedy and attempted to save his life. Both surgeons believed that Kennedy had been struck from the front as well as the rear.
The bullet that killed him, I think, was fired from the front and hit him in the hairline and then blew out the back of his skull on the right side.
And this is where your thinking differs from the Warren Commission's report.
Yes.
They reportedly came under intense pressure to remain quiet about it and wouldn't come forward for nearly 30 years. Dulles would claim that after he heard the news of Kennedy's death, he would head back home to Washington, but his own personal datebook reveals that this was a lie, and he actually spent the entire weekend at Camp Peary, known by CIA case officers as the Farm. The Farm is the location of a secret training base for CIA officers of the Directorate of Operations, the clandestine service of the agency. Here, recruits are trained in espionage before they're sent overseas. From November 22nd through the 24th, Dulles, the now retired spy chief, would set up a base of operations there. This highly eventful weekend would see the arrest of Oswald, his questioning by Dallas police, the return of Kennedy's body to Washington, and the return of his limousine, where Secret Service agents dumped water into the bloodstains in the upholstery, completely destroying the evidence. Oswald would also be murdered over the weekend. Future CIA Director Richard Helms would personally persuade President Johnson to appoint Dulles to the Warren Commission. He wanted to make sure no agency secrets came out during the investigation. And of course, if Dulles was on the commission, that would ensure the agency would be safe. Johnson felt the same way. He didn't want the investigation to dig up anything strange. Over the course of the investigations, Dulles would write novelist Rebecca West, struggling to come up with a motive for Oswald. I wish sometime you would sit down and write me a line as to why you think Lee Oswald did the dastardly deed. All I can tell you is that there is not one iota of evidence that he had any personal vindictiveness against the man Kennedy. 3 years after the Warren Commission ended, 2/3 of Americans polled did not agree with its outcome, which said that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. At the end of 1969, Allen Dulles came down with a bad case of the flu, which was so severe that it left him bedridden. By Christmas Eve, Dulles would be in Georgetown University Hospital. The infection had spread to his chest and turned into pneumonia. A month later, on January 29, 1969, Allen Dulles finally passed away due to complications from his illness. He lived to be 75 years old. So, who do you think killed Kennedy? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone, and a special thank you to my patrons. Plenty more videos on the way. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. Thanks, everyone, and take care.